are following breaking news where the fate of the president's sweeping tariff agenda is now in the hands of the Supreme Court. Justice is hearing arguments today on a case challenging the president's International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose many of those sweeping tariffs. The court's 3 liberal justices pressed Solicitor General John Sauer on whether the president's tariffs are infringing on Congress's authority to impose tariffs. And some of the court's conservative justices expressed skepticism as well, including Justice Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, who challenged the administration over its sweeping view of executive authority.
Because you say we shouldn't be concerned because this is foreign affairs and the president has inherent authority, and so delegation off the books, more or less. And if that's true, what would prohibit Congress from just abdicating all responsibility to regulate foreign commerce, for that matter, declare war, to the president?
We don't contend that he could do that. If it did.
In international trade law and policy, thanks to both of you for being here. Lawrence, let me start with you. So what an exchange there. You heard the folks in court actually start to laugh. It's not something you typically hear at the Supreme Court. What were your takeaways from what you heard today at the High Court? Do the justices seem to be skeptical of the government's argument here?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a sign that both liberal and conservative justices were pushing back on the solicited arguments that you had there. And, you know, this is a court with a 6-3 conservative majority that has often backed President Trump in other cases that have come up recently. But this one is a slightly different case. It's a much closer call. And I think, you know, it's early to sort of say how it's going to come out. You know, we'll wait to see what the ruling says. But I think...
Okay, so picture this. You're Donald Trump. For months, your entire legal strategy has been built on one argument: presidential immunity. You've been telling courts that as a former president, you can't be prosecuted for actions you took while in office, that presidents have blanket immunity for official acts, that prosecuting you would set a dangerous precedent. And your lawyers have been arguing this in every case: in the January 6th case, in the classified documents case, in the hush money case, everywhere. It's been your shield, your protection, your get out of jail free card. And then boom, the Supreme Court issues a ruling, and it destroys your defense. The court says no, presidents don't have blanket immunity. You can be prosecuted for unofficial acts, for private conduct, for crimes committed while in office that weren't part of your official duties. And the D.C. Circuit Court goes even further. They say explicitly, no president, including Donald Trump, has blanket immunity for any and all criminal acts they might commit while in office. That's it. That's your entire defense strategy gone, obliterated. And now every case that was stalled while courts considered immunity arguments, they're back on. Prosecutors are reviving indictments, judges are scheduling trials, and you're facing criminal prosecution on multiple fronts with no immunity protection, and you're losing it. You're raging on Truth Social. You're attacking judges. You're claiming the system is rigged because your last line of defense just collapsed, and there's nothing you can do to stop what's coming. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
You're correct. This is still a very close decision. The court's 3 Democratic justices will probably vote against President Trump's tariffs. And then the question is whether some of the other members of the court also have concerns about the president's use of this law. And the argument focused quite heavily on the law used by President Trump, IEPA, and whether that law, which gives the power to the president to regulate imports, also includes the power to impose tariffs. That dominated most of the hearing. And I'll say the justices asked very difficult questions of both sides.
Lawrence, I want to play another exchange, this one with Chief Justice John Roberts. Get your reaction on the other side. Take a look.
I mean, it's been suggested that the tariffs are responsible for significant reduction in our deficit. I would say that's raising revenue domestically.
There certainly is an incidental and collateral effect of the tariffs that they do raise revenue, but it's very important that they are regulatory tariffs, not revenue-raising tariffs.
This is wild. This is absolutely devastating for Trump, because presidential immunity was his best argument, his strongest defense, and the Supreme Court, including the conservative justices he appointed, just struck it down. Not completely. The court said presidents have immunity for core official acts, things that are central to the president's constitutional duties, But for unofficial acts, for private conduct, for crimes that aren't part of the president's official responsibilities, no immunity. You can be prosecuted like anyone else, and that opens the door to multiple prosecutions, because most of what Trump is accused of doesn't qualify as official acts. Trying to overturn an election, that's not an official presidential duty. Paying hush money to a porn star, that's private conduct. Obstructing investigations, that's criminal behavior, not official presidential action. So the immunity defense doesn't protect Trump from most of the charges he's facing. And prosecutors know it, Jack Smith knows it, state prosecutors know it, and they're moving forward, reviving cases, presenting evidence, preparing for trials. So let's talk about it. Let's break down what the Supreme Court actually ruled, why it destroys Trump's immunity defense, what cases are now moving forward, and how Trump is responding. Because trust me, this is a game changer. This is the moment when Trump's legal strategy collapsed and his path to prison became clear. Now, the Supreme Court ruling came on July 1st, 2024, and it was a landmark decision about presidential immunity. Trump had argued for absolute immunity, that presidents can't be prosecuted for anything they do while in office, that prosecuting former presidents would cripple the presidency by making presidents afraid to act. And the court rejected that. They said presidents have absolute immunity for core official acts, things like directing the military, conducting diplomacy, exercising pardon power, the constitutional duties that only presidents can perform. Presidents have presumptive immunity for peripheral official acts, things that are related to official duties but not core functions. This immunity can be overcome if prosecutors can show that prosecution wouldn't interfere with executive functions, but presidents have no immunity for private or unofficial acts, things that aren't part of being president, personal conduct, criminal behavior, private business dealings. Those actions can be prosecuted just like they would be for anyone else. And that's the key, because most of what Trump is accused of falls into that third category: unofficial acts, private conduct, things that have nothing to do with his official duties as president. So the immunity defense doesn't protect him. Now, the D.C. Circuit Court made this even more explicit. In their ruling on Trump's immunity claims, they said clearly, no president, including Donald Trump, has blanket immunity for any and all criminal acts they might commit while in office. That's a direct rejection of Trump's argument. That's the court saying, you're not above the law, you can be prosecuted. Presidential immunity doesn't protect you from criminal charges for unofficial acts. And that ruling applies to all of Trump's cases. Any case where Trump's alleged crimes were unofficial acts, immunity doesn't protect him, and that's most of them. Federal judges have now been instructed to review whether the evidence against Trump relates to official acts or private actions, to determine what's protected by immunity and what's not, and then to allow prosecution to proceed for the unprotected conduct. That means cases that were stalled are now moving forward, prosecutors are presenting evidence, courts are evaluating what's official versus unofficial, and trials are being scheduled. Trump's team is appealing. They're trying to get the Supreme Court to expand immunity protections, but based on the court's July ruling, that's unlikely. The court has already drawn the lines. Official acts are protected, unofficial acts are not, and Trump's alleged crimes are mostly unofficial, so the appeals are probably going to fail, which means prosecutions are going to proceed, and Trump is going to face trials, multiple trials, for election interference, for obstruction, for hush money payments, for classified documents. All the charges he's been avoiding through immunity arguments, they're all back on the table, and Trump knows it. That's why he's losing it. That's why he's raging, because his legal protection just evaporated, and criminal prosecution is now inevitable. So yeah, this is the story. Trump loses it after Supreme Court ruling strikes down his immunity. The court saying presidents can be prosecuted for unofficial acts. Trump's entire defense strategy collapsing, and multiple criminal cases now moving forward. Let's break it down. All right, so let's dig into what the Supreme Court actually ruled and why it's so devastating for Trump's legal defense. Because this ruling changes everything. It removes Trump's primary protection against prosecution and opens the door to multiple criminal trials. Let's start with the Supreme Court's framework for presidential immunity. The court created a three-tier system in their July 2024 ruling in Trump v. United States. Tier 1 is absolute immunity for core official acts. These are actions that are central to the president's constitutional responsibilities, things that only the president can do: commanding the military, conducting foreign policy, granting pardons, recognizing foreign governments. These core executive functions are absolutely protected. Presidents can't be prosecuted for how they exercise these powers, even if their decisions are controversial or harmful. The immunity is absolute. Tier 2 is presumptive immunity for peripheral official acts. These are actions related to the president's official duties, but not core constitutional functions. Things like managing executive branch personnel, making policy decisions, directing agency actions. For these acts, there's a presumption of immunity, but it can be overcome. prosecutors can argue that prosecuting these acts wouldn't interfere with executive functions, that the public interest in accountability outweighs immunity concerns, and if they make that showing, prosecution can proceed. Tier 3 is no immunity for private or unofficial acts. These are things the president does that have nothing to do with official responsibilities: personal conduct, private business dealings, campaign activities, criminal behavior unrelated to presidential duties. For these acts, presidents have no immunity at all. They can be prosecuted just like any other citizen. And that three-tier framework is what destroys Trump's defense. Because Trump has been arguing for blanket immunity, for protection from all prosecution for anything he did while president. But the court rejected that. They said immunity only applies to official acts, and even for some official acts, immunity can be overcome. So Trump doesn't have the blanket protection he's been claiming. Now let's apply this framework to Trump's cases, and you'll see why Trump is in trouble. The January 6th case and election interference charges. Trump is accused of trying to overturn the 2020 election, of pressuring state officials to change results, of organizing fake electors, of inciting the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Is any of that official presidential conduct? No. Overturning elections isn't a presidential duty. The president's job is to faithfully execute the laws and ensure peaceful transitions of power. Trying to overturn an election is the opposite of that. It's private political conduct, campaign-related activity, not official presidential action, so no immunity. Trump can be prosecuted for all of it. The hush money case, Trump is accused of paying off Stormy Daniels and others to hide affairs, of falsifying business records to cover up those payments. That's entirely private conduct. It's about Trump's personal life, his private business, his efforts to protect his reputation, and his campaign. None of that is official presidential action, so no immunity. Trump can be prosecuted. The classified documents case, Trump is accused of taking classified documents when he left office, of storing them improperly at Mar-a-Lago, of obstructing efforts to retrieve them. Some of this might involve official acts. Taking documents could arguably be related to presidential responsibilities, but obstructing the investigation, that's not official conduct, that's criminal behavior. So Trump can be prosecuted for obstruction, even if some other aspects might be protected. The obstruction of justice charges, Trump is accused of trying to interfere with various investigations, of pressuring witnesses, of directing subordinates to destroy evidence. None of that is official presidential conduct. The president's job is to ensure faithful execution of the laws. Obstructing investigations is the opposite, is criminal conduct, so no immunity. So across Trump's major cases, most of the charges involve unofficial acts, private conduct, criminal behavior, things that aren't protected by presidential immunity, and that means Trump can be prosecuted. His immunity defense doesn't work. Now, the D.C. Circuit Court's ruling made this even more explicit. When Trump appealed his January 6th case, arguing presidential immunity, the D.C. Circuit rejected his argument decisively. They said no president, including Donald Trump, has blanket immunity for any and all criminal acts they might commit while in office. That's clear. That's unambiguous. Trump doesn't have the immunity protection he's claiming, and the Circuit Court went further. They explained that accepting Trump's argument would mean presidents could commit any crime while in office and never face consequences, could order assassinations, could sell pardons, could engage in corruption, and be immune from prosecution. The court said that's absurd. That's not what the Constitution requires. That would make presidents into kings. So they rejected Trump's blanket immunity claim, and that ruling applies to all of Trump's cases. Any case where Trump argues immunity for criminal conduct, this ruling says no, you don't have immunity for crimes, you can be prosecuted. Now, Trump tried to appeal to the Supreme Court. He wanted the court to block the D.C. Circuit's ruling to prevent prosecution from proceeding, but the Supreme Court refused. They didn't grant a stay, they didn't block prosecution, they let the cases move forward. And in their July ruling, they endorsed the framework the D.C. Circuit used. Official acts are protected, unofficial acts are not. So the Supreme Court agrees with the D.C. Circuit. Trump doesn't have blanket immunity. He can be prosecuted for unofficial acts. Now there's a process that has to happen. Federal judges need to review the evidence in each case. They need to determine what evidence relates to official acts versus unofficial acts. Evidence about official acts can't be used at trial, but evidence about unofficial acts can be. So judges are going through the evidence, categorizing it, deciding what can be used for prosecution. And in most of Trump's cases, most of the evidence relates to unofficial acts. So most of the evidence can be used and prosecution can proceed. Jack Smith, the special counsel, is doing exactly this. He's presenting evidence to judges, showing that Trump's alleged crimes were unofficial acts, arguing that immunity doesn't apply, and preparing to take Trump to trial. And judges are agreeing. They're finding that Trump's conduct was largely unofficial, that immunity doesn't protect him. that prosecution can proceed. So trials are being scheduled, evidence is being prepared, and Trump is facing the prospect of multiple criminal trials with no immunity protection. Trump's legal team is scrambling. They're filing appeals, trying to get courts to expand immunity protections, arguing for delays, but it's not working because the Supreme Court has already ruled. They've set the framework, and under that framework, Trump doesn't have immunity for most of what he's accused of. So the appeals are failing, the delays aren't working, and trials are moving forward. Now let's talk about the political implications of this ruling. Because the Supreme Court's decision doesn't just affect Trump's cases, it sets precedent for all future presidents. It establishes that presidents can be held criminally accountable for unofficial acts, that they can't use their office as a shield against prosecution for crimes, and that's important. For years, there's been debate about whether former presidents can be prosecuted. Nixon was pardoned, so we never got a definitive answer, but now we have one. The Supreme Court says yes. Presidents can be prosecuted for crimes committed while in office, as long as those crimes were unofficial acts. That's a victory for rule of law, for the principle that nobody is above the law, not even presidents, and it means future presidents will have to be more careful. They'll know that criminal conduct could result in prosecution, that presidential immunity won't protect them if they commit crimes, that there are consequences for abusing power. So the ruling constrains presidential power, it reinforces accountability, and it strengthens American democracy. But for Trump, it's a disaster because it removes his primary legal defense and exposes him to multiple criminal prosecutions. So yeah, this is where we are. The Supreme Court ruling that destroys Trump's immunity defense, the D.C. Circuit explicitly rejecting blanket immunity, judges reviewing evidence and finding Trump's conduct was largely unofficial, and prosecutions moving forward across multiple cases. Let's talk about what happens next. Okay, so let's break down what the Supreme Court's immunity ruling means for Trump going forward, for his criminal cases, for his political future, and for American democracy. Because this is a watershed moment. This is the legal system finally holding a president accountable. First, let's talk about Trump's immediate legal jeopardy. Because with immunity protection gone, Trump faces multiple criminal trials. The January 6th case is moving forward. Jack Smith is prosecuting Trump for election interference, for trying to overturn the 2020 election. And without immunity protection, this case is strong. Smith has evidence, witness testimony, documents showing Trump's involvement in schemes to overturn election results. And Trump can't hide behind immunity anymore. So this trial is happening. And based on the evidence, conviction is likely. The hush money case is proceeding. Trump was already convicted in New York on charges related to falsifying business records to cover up hush money payments. Trump tried to argue that some evidence should have been excluded based on immunity, but judges are rejecting that. The conduct was private. The evidence is admissible. So Trump's conviction stands and sentencing will proceed. The classified documents case is complicated. Some aspects might involve official acts, but the obstruction charges are clearly unofficial. Trump obstructing the investigation is criminal conduct, not official action. So those charges can proceed, and Trump faces serious prison time if convicted. Other cases are being reviewed. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions are looking at whether they can bring charges against Trump, and with immunity protection gone, more cases are likely. So Trump is looking at multiple trials, multiple potential convictions, and serious prison time, and there's no immunity defense to save him. Second, let's talk about Trump's response. Because he's not handling this well, Trump has been raging on Truth Social, attacking judges, calling the rulings rigged and politically motivated, claiming he's being persecuted. But those attacks aren't working. They're not changing the legal reality. Courts have ruled immunity doesn't protect Trump for unofficial acts, and his alleged crimes were largely unofficial. So prosecution proceeds regardless of Trump's complaints. Trump's legal team is filing appeals, but those appeals are going nowhere. The Supreme Court has already set the framework. Lower courts are applying it, and Trump's arguments are being rejected. Trump is also threatening retaliation, saying if he wins in 2028, he'll go after his prosecutors. He'll prosecute Jack Smith. He'll use the Justice Department against his enemies. But those threats are backfiring. They make Trump look authoritarian. They reinforce that Trump doesn't respect rule of law, and they motivate prosecutors to work harder. Because they know if Trump isn't held accountable now, he'll abuse power even more if he gets back in office. Third, let's talk about what this means for the 2026 elections. Because Trump facing multiple criminal trials is going to dominate the political landscape. Republicans are going to have to defend a candidate who's on trial, who's facing serious criminal charges, who could be convicted and sentenced to prison. That's a difficult political position. Some Republicans will stick with Trump. They'll claim the prosecutions are political. They'll rally around him, but others will distance themselves. They'll recognize that backing a convicted criminal is political suicide. They'll look for alternatives, and the party will be divided. Democrats will use Trump's trials as evidence that he's unfit for office, that he's a criminal, that he belongs in prison, not the White House. They'll point to the evidence, to the convictions, to Trump's own conduct, and they'll argue that Republicans who support Trump are complicit, that they're putting party over country, and that messaging will resonate with voters because seeing a former president on trial, potentially being convicted, that's powerful. That makes Trump's criminality real in a way that political attacks never could. Fourth, let's talk about what this ruling means for presidential accountability, because this is historic. The Supreme Court has established that presidents can be held criminally accountable for unofficial acts, that immunity doesn't protect presidents who commit crimes, and that's a victory for rule of law. For years, there's been concern that presidents are above the law, that they can commit crimes without consequences, that the constitutional system can't hold them accountable. But this ruling shows that's not true. Presidents can be prosecuted, they can be convicted, they can go to prison, just like anyone else, as long as their crimes were unofficial acts. And that's how it should be, because democracy depends on accountability, on the principle that nobody, not even the most powerful person in the country, is above the law. So this ruling strengthens democracy. It reaffirms that constitutional limits exist, that rule of law matters, that power doesn't grant immunity from justice. Fifth, let's talk about the precedent for future presidents, because this ruling doesn't just affect Trump, it sets standards for all future presidents. Future presidents now know that if they commit crimes, they can be prosecuted, that unofficial criminal conduct isn't protected by immunity, that there are consequences for abusing power, and that creates incentives for presidents to follow the law, to respect constitutional limits, to think carefully before engaging in questionable conduct, because they know prosecution is possible. So the ruling constrains presidential power, it makes presidents more accountable, and it protects democracy by ensuring that presidents can't act like kings. 6. Let's talk about what justice looks like. Because if Trump is convicted and sentenced based on this ruling, that's justice working. That's the legal system holding a powerful person accountable. Trump allegedly committed serious crimes. He tried to overturn an election. He obstructed investigations. He paid hush money and falsified records to cover it up. And the Supreme Court has ruled that he doesn't have immunity for those crimes, so he should be prosecuted. He should face trial, and if the evidence supports it, he should be convicted and sentenced to prison. That's not political persecution. That's rule of law. That's accountability. And that's what should happen when anyone, including presidents, commits crimes. So what's the bottom line? The Supreme Court has struck down Trump's immunity defense. They've ruled that presidents don't have blanket immunity, that they can be prosecuted for unofficial acts, and that destroys Trump's primary legal defense. The D.C. Circuit explicitly rejected Trump's claims, said no president has immunity for all criminal acts, and applied that ruling to Trump's cases. Federal judges are reviewing evidence, determining what's official versus unofficial, and finding that most of Trump's conduct was unofficial, so prosecutions are proceeding. Jack Smith is moving forward with the January 6th case. State prosecutors are proceeding with hush money charges. Other cases are being revived, and Trump faces multiple trials with no immunity protection. Trump is losing it, raging on social media, attacking judges, filing desperate appeals that are going nowhere because his legal strategy has collapsed. His immunity defense is gone, and criminal prosecution is now inevitable. This is a watershed moment. The Supreme Court establishing that presidents can be held accountable, that immunity doesn't protect criminal conduct, that rule of law applies even to the most powerful. And Trump is about to find out what that means. Trials are coming, convictions are likely, prison time is possible, and Trump's rage won't change any of it, because the law has finally caught up to him, and justice is about to be served.